Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump have exchanged handshakes at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum in Vietnam, but an anticipated formal meeting between the two leaders didn't materialise. RT's Ilya Petrenka is in Da Nang for us.
Here's how one of the most anticipated scenes of the APEC summit in the Vietnamese city of Da Nang unraveled. The heads of state were already lining up for the so-called family photo ceremony wearing traditional Vietnamese outfits. Vladimir Putin was already standing in front of the cameras, and then Donald Trump came in. He approached Mr. Putin, they shook hands, and then we saw them standing together for the actual photo. Now, here's another thing that I also noticed at the actual gala dinner table. On the hosting leaders' right and left, we saw the leader of China, Xi Jinping, and the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, while Donald Trump was sat somewhere on the opposite side. We've seen the Putin-Trump handshake here in Vietnam, but no formal meeting or talks that many people here were really expecting. I can tell you that journalists were on the brink of, so to say, harassing the officials on both sides, Russian and American, about the possibility of the meeting, but the formal meeting didn't happen. Maybe some other time.
Now, the White House press secretary, Sarah Sanders, said the official meeting couldn't take place because of, quote, scheduling conflicts on both sides. Was that the case? Let's discuss this with author and Russia analyst Martin McCauley. Joins me on the line. Good evening, Martin. Well, it was reported,
good evening,
separate to what Sarah Sanders said, that there were certain disagreements within the Trump administration towards a meeting between the leaders. What do you think's gone on?
I think it reveals that the Trump administration is a weak administration. It's split several ways, and everyone knows it's split in two basic groups. One group which would favor a rapprochement with Russia, closer relations, let's solve these problems which are dividing us, and the others, no, we don't want that, because if you do that, you play into the Democrats' hands, you play into our opponents' hands, you play into Robert Mueller's hands, the investigator who's looking into these things. We don't want any more contacts. Any contact with any Russian official now is in fact dangerous. In fact, it could lead to misrepresentation, and it could look bad back in the United States. Mr. Mueller will look at it and say, perhaps there's something I can learn from that. And of course, the Democrats will weigh in by saying, right, Trump is there to make concessions to President Putin. He's a weak president, and he's got to do something, and he wants to do a deal. And from his point of view, a deal is one where benefits are on both sides. And for a lot of American politicians, especially in the Democrat side, they don't want any deal with Russia, even though it may be advantage to America itself.
Such is the demonising of Russia and Putin at the moment, and the scrutiny of Donald Trump for alleged connections with Russia. Presumably, the media and investigators in Congress will be obsessed with anything that happens now. So even, for example, something as seemingly innocent as them standing next to each other and shaking hands, there can be repercussions, yeah? There can people reading things into this.
Yes, in fact, it goes back to criminology, where you analysed those who were on the podium for on the Lenin's mausoleum when there was a march past. Who was standing beside whom? Has somebody been moved one place to the left or one place to the right? That means he's been downgraded or upgraded and so on. And they're playing the same thing here. It's quite extraordinary that President Trump would then shake hands with President Putin, and then somebody would put, on the American side, I presume, would pull the plug and say, no, we can't go ahead because this would look bad back in America and it will do you harm. And the situation is toxic now, because the American administration really is afraid to meet any Russian official because it can be misconstrued, it can be used by the political enemies back in the United States. And the Democrats love this, and the press love it, because they want this type of information, and they will make a big thing of this. And I wouldn't be surprised if some story came up saying that Putin had decided he didn't want to meet President Trump, that in fact he was the one who pulled out of the meeting because he'd been offended by something. They could just basically make up anything, if you like, fake news. You're in a realm of fake news, and it's quite extraordinary, which means the American administration at present is very weak and very divided, which is very, very bad, not only for America, but also for Russia and the world, because you need a strong government and a strong president in the United States, because the world needs one, and because of the difficulties which are in the international arena.
And I think I can safely say, thank goodness that Putin didn't high-five Donald Trump as he did the Peruvian leader. Otherwise, I think the Western media would have spontaneously combusted. Nonetheless, media speculation, and they're saying that Washington was waiting for Moscow to agree on certain conditions for the meeting. Is that likely, do you think?
They're always behind the scenes debates and discussions, and you have to talk through and agree how you're going to have the meeting, what's going to be discussed, and you work out what's going to be in the communique afterwards, what you're going to say afterwards. And obviously they couldn't agree. And I take it that they couldn't agree because the American camp was divided. They didn't speak with one voice. And had they spoken with one voice, then they could have come to some agreement. And I presume that the Russian side spoke with one voice. They had a policy, they had worked out their line and so on. But there was squabbling on the American side, revealing again the weakness of the American administration and their inability really to fashion a policy which is a straight line. One is given the impression that it's always zigzag. You can never be sure which direction they're going to go in. And after this really farce, one could say, when President Putin then moves on to, I think he's going on to the Philippines, he'll try and put that behind him and so on. But of course the press in America will have a field day because they will highlight this as the one mistake or the one failure of his Asian trip. Because if you go back to his meeting with Xi Jinping and the way he was received royally, some people said royally, in Beijing and so on, and in China, nobody would have accused the Chinese of nefarious actions and so on. And the Americans seem to be speaking with one voice there. But when it comes to Vietnam and Da Nang, when it comes to President Putin, then they split and they squabble among themselves. And it does not reflect very well on US diplomacy, and doesn't reflect very well on the US president.
Martin, good to have you on. Appreciate your views. Martin McCall is my guest, author and Russia analyst.